The pandemic has been a time of paradox. We've sheltered in place to protect each other, but also spilled out into the streets to protest police brutality. I've swerved off the sidewalk to avoid coming within 6 feet of a neighbor, but also learned the names of everyone on my street for the first time as I put together a mutual aid listserv. Now, it's the people nearest us, whom we may not have known or chosen deliberately, whom we have to rely on. The pandemic is pushing us past the limits of whom we previously trusted ourselves to. Our challenge is to remain connected and to question the structures that kept us from knowing, loving, and serving each other until a disaster closed off all other options. The coronavirus crisis hits the already vulnerable hardest. It makes them suffer, but it also restores them to visibility. The grandmother in a nursing home running with insufficient staff, the children who rely on free school lunch to be able to eat, the warehouse worker who, despite taking extra shifts, is still one of the 40% of Americans who couldn't raise the cash to cover a $400 expense on short notice. Those vulnerabilities will persist long after a vaccine. Pope Francis reminded the world, in his out-of-season Urbi et Orbi blessing, that the unusual suffering caused by the novel coronavirus should also draw our attention to the suffering we ignore because it is not novel. He said, "We did not stop at God's reproach to us. We were not shaken awake by wars or injustice across the world, nor did we listen to the cry of the poor or of our ailing planet. We carried on regardless, thinking we would stay healthy in a world that was sick." His prayers and exhortations aren't focused on simply returning to normal, since in the normal world, many people live through daily, lonely cataclysms. We are called to retain our present sense of solidarity, and if we love our neighbor as ourselves, to enter into their suffering and need, even when, especially when, it becomes a choice again. We can make an individual effort. We can choose not to conceal our own weaknesses and need, and thus to proclaim that we don't find weakness shameful. The more I live my own needs and griefs publicly, even in small things, the more I'm asked for help or to enter into another person's grief. We testify in our day-to-day lives whether we believe other people are discardable. But individual action isn't enough. We also have to be alert to structural factors that push the weak and the vulnerable out of visibility. That culture of concealment kills. We should immediately become suspicious when we interact with a company or a product that hides its workers. The people who work under inhumane conditions are hidden in the hopes of selling a frictionless experience to consumers. Our iPhones are made in sweatshop conditions, with workers under such pressure that factories have had to install nets to forestall suicides. But every element of Apple's design is meant to present their phones as a magical product, divorced from someone's hard work. Even the bodies of the phone reflect this philosophy. They're sealed with proprietary screws to prevent consumers from opening the phones and seeing them as a made and remakeable object. Closer to home, restaurants struggle to pay just wages, pegging their prices to levels that don't reflect the true cost of harvesting or preparing their food. Tipping furthers this illusion. It implies that the price on the menu covers the cost of the work, and we generously choose to add a gratuity. But the payment is anything but superfluous. New disruptive companies like DoorDash have even stolen tips from their workers, using the amount a customer pays to cover what DoorDash owes the worker, rather than adding it on as additional earned compensation. The only way to be sure the tips stay with the worker is to tip off the books in cash. The customer has to reintroduce the friction and inconvenience that comes with deliberate action, while the company tries to make the whole process as smooth and invisible and unchosen as possible. Our job is to keep fighting against ease and convenience and to reintroduce the friction that comes with choosing. It's the cost of telling the truth and seeing others. Our economy and our society are out of joint. Too often the default choice is the wrong one, and the default view leaves others out of the picture. It's our job to fight for near-term reforms, to relieve the pressure on those who can't be asked to wait for a comprehensive solution. But also, it's our job to not limit our imaginations to simply small improvements to the system we've been shaped by. To break free of our assumptions, it helps to read older books, foreign books, anything to get away from the limits presumed by present-day politics and culture. One book that productively jarred me out of complacency was Lewis Hyde's The Gift, especially in his discussion of the historical prohibition of usury. The first loosenings of usury restrictions, he explained, were in order to make businesses like pawn shops sustainable as businesses. They needed to be able to cover the cost of their workers' wages. And that sounded pretty reasonable to me. But Lewis explains the restrictions existed because giving money to people who needed it wasn't supposed to be a business at all. It wasn't supposed to be anybody's job. He writes, "This, of course, is precisely why usury had been prohibited in the first place. The spirit of the gift demands that no one make a living off another man's need. A group of people comes to be called a brotherhood, not only when the circulation of gifts assures that no one has lost touch with the sources of wealth, but also when no individuals in the group can make a private living by standing in the stream where surplus wealth flows toward need. If there are always enough needy people around to feed a group of pawnbrokers, then something is seriously wrong with the brotherhood." It's that image that stuck with me. No individual can make a private living by standing in the stream where surplus wealth flows toward need. Hyde is talking about a world that takes the dignity of need as seriously as the law of gravity. As water flows downhill, so too excess wealth, by its very nature, is compelled to flow toward need. But if we look at what we've built, we live in a world of dams, of stagnant ponds, of dry riverbeds at what used to be a delta. The natural flow has been diverted, and the people who are in need have been hidden. We've all been complicit in their concealment, lest the fact of their need spur us to bring the dams down. The pandemic has been a different season, and suddenly everyone seems to understand, or at least many people, that river that is meant to flow from excess wealth to those in need. That's why mutual aid networks have sprung up. That's why restaurants have given away the food that they were no longer able to sell to the people who are hungry. Because we all understand the dignity of need is a law of nature. The pandemic is a roll call of injustices. Everywhere, people have been marginalized, ignored, and pushed aside. Disease and economic turmoil has hit them more harshly. We need to be keeping our eyes open and working for social and economic justice that asks for more than a return to the status quo. After the coronavirus, joblessness, homelessness, hunger, and precarity will all be treated as not newsworthy because it isn't linked to a cataclysm that unites us all. But we know better, and we have to do better. We don't want to live our lives so that we require or even invite a visible disaster in order to open our eyes and see the less visible wounds that still afflict our neighbors.